Page 325. We beg the reader throughout to keep in mind, from 1918 on, our judicial custom determined that every Moscow trial, except of course the unjust trial of the Chekists, was by no means an isolated trial of an accidental concatenation of circumstances which had converged by accident. It was a landmark of judicial policy. It was a display window model whose specifications determined what product was good for the provinces too. It was a standard. It was like that one and only model solution up front in the arithmetic book for the school children to follow for themselves. Thus, when we say the trial of the churchmen, this must be understood in the multiple plural, many trials. And in fact, the Supreme Accuser himself willingly explains, such trials have rolled along through almost all the tribunals of the Republic. What language? They had taken place not long before in the tribunals in North Dvina, Tver and Ryazan, in Saratov, in Kazan, Ufa, Solzhenitsyn, and Sarevakokashsk. Wow. Trials were held for the clergy, the choirs, and the active members of the congregation, representatives of the ungrateful Orthodox Church liberated by the October Revolution. The reader will be aware of a conflict here. Why did many of these trials occur earlier than the Moscow model? This is simply a shortcoming of our exposition. The judicial and extrajudicial persecution of the liberated church had begun well back in 1918, and judging by the Svingrad affair, it had already reached a peak of insanity by that summer. In October 1918, Patriarch Tikhon had protested in a message to the Council of People's Commissars that there was no freedom to preach in the churches, and that many courageous priests have already paid for their preaching with the blood of martyrdom. You have laid your hands on church property collected by generations of believers, and you have not hesitated to violate their posthumous intent. The People's Commissars did not, of course, read the message, but the members of their administrative staff must have had a good laugh. Now they've really got something to reproach us with. Posthumous intent. We shit on your ancestors. We are only interested in descendants. They are executing bishops, priests, monks, and nuns who are guilty of nothing on the basis of indiscriminate charges of indefinite and vaguely counter-revolutionary offenses, unquote. True, with the approach of the Denikin and Kolchak, this was stopped so as to make it easier for Orthodox believers to defend the revolution. But hardly had the Civil War begun to die down then they took up their cudgels against the church again, and the cases started rolling through the tribunals once more. In 1920, they struck at the Trinity St. Sergei Monastery and went straight to the holy relics of that chauvinist Sergius of Radonej, and hauled them off to Moscow to a museum. The People's Commissariat of Justice issued a directive dated August 25, 1920, for the liquidation of relics of all kinds, since they were a significant obstacle to the resplendent movement toward a new just society. Pursuing further Krylenko's own selection of cases, let us also examine the case tried in the in other words, the Supreme Tribunal. How affectionately they abbreviated words within their intimate circle, but how they roared out for us little insects, the rise, the courtesan session. Letter E, the case of the Tactical Center, August 16 to 20, 1920. In this case, there were 28 defendants present, plus additional defendants who were being tried in absentia because they weren't around. At the very beginning of his impassioned speech, in a voice not yet grown hoarse, and in phrases illuminated by class analysis, the supreme accuser informs us that in addition to the landowners and capitalists, quote, there existed and there continues to exist one additional social stratum, the social characteristics of which have long since been under consideration by the representatives of revolutionary socialism. In other words, to be or not to be. The stratum is the so-called intelligentsia. In this trial, we shall be concerned with the judgment of history on the activity of the Russian intelligentsia, unquote, and with the verdict of the revolution on it. The narrow limits of our investigation prevent our comprehending exactly the particular manner in which the representatives of revolutionary socialism were taking under consideration the fate of the so-called intelligentsia and what specifically they were planning to do for it, or were planning for it. However, we take comfort in the fact that these materials have been published, that they are accessible to everyone, and that they can be assembled in any required detail. Therefore, solely to understand the overall atmosphere of the Republic, we shall recall the opinion of the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars in the years when all these tribunal sessions were going on. In a letter to Gorky on September 15, 1919, which we have already cited, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin replied to Gorky's attempts to intercede in the arrests of members of the intelligentsia, among them, evidently, some of the defendants in this trial, and commenting on the bulk of the Russian intelligentsia of those years, close to the cadets' intelligentsia, he wrote, quote, in actual fact, they are not the nation's brains, but shit, unquote. On another occasion, he said to Gorky, quote, if we break too many pots, it's the intelligentsia's fault, unquote. If the intelligentsia wants justice, why doesn't it come over to us? Quote, I've gotten one bullet from the intelligentsia myself, unquote. In other words, from Kaplan. On the basis of these feelings, he expressed his mistrust and hostility towards the intelligentsia, rotten liberal, pious, the slovenliness so customary among educated people. And he believed the intelligentsia was always short-sighted, that it had betrayed the cause of the workers. But when the intelligentsia ever swore loyalty to the cause of the workers, the dictatorship of the workers, when had they? This mockery of the intelligentsia, this contempt for the intelligentsia, was subsequently adopted with enthusiasm by the publicists of the newspapers of the 20s, and was absorbed into the current of day-to-day life. And in the end, the members of the intelligentsia accepted it too, cursing their eternal thoughtlessness, their eternal duality, their eternal spinelessness, and their hopeless lagging behind the times. And this was just the voice. The voice of the accusing power echoed and re-echoed beneath the vaults of the factory, returning to us to the defendant's bench. The social stratum has, during recent years, undergone the trial of universal reevaluation. Yes, it's reevaluation was so often said at the time. And how did the reevaluation occur? Here's how. The Russian intelligentsia, which entered the crucible of the revolution with slogans of power for the people, so it had to be something after all, emerged from it an ally of the black, not even the white, generals, and hired an obedient agent of European imperialism. The intelligentsia trampled on its own banners, as in the army, yes, and covered them with mud, unquote. How indeed can we not cry out in our hearts in repentance? How can we not lacerate our chests with our fingernails? The only reason why there is no need to deal out the death blow to its individual representatives is that this social group has outlived its time. Here at the start of the 20th century, what power of foresight! Oh, the scientific revolutionaries! However, the intelligentsia has to be finished off anyway. Throughout the 20s, they kept finishing them off and finishing them off. Excuse me. We examined with hostility the 28 individual allies of the black generals, the hirelings of European imperialism, and we are especially aroused by the stench of the word center. Now we see a tactical center, now a national center, and now a right center. And in our recollection of those trials of 2 decades, centers keep creeping in all the time. Centers of centers, engineers centers, Menshevik centers, Trotskyite, Zinovieite centers, rightist, Bukharinite centers, but all of them are crushed, all crushed. And that is the only reason you and I are still alive. Where there is a center, of course, the hand of imperialism can be found. True, we feel a measure of relief when we learn that the tactical center on this occasion was not an organization, that it did not have A, statutes, 2, a program, 3, membership dues. So what did it have? Here's what. They used to meet. Goose pimples up and down the back. And when they met, they undertook to familiarize themselves with one another's point of view. I see chills. The charges were extremely serious and were supported by the evidence. There were 2 pieces of evidence to corroborate the charges against 28 accused individuals. These were 2 letters from the people who were not present in court because they were abroad. Myakhtin and Fyodorov. They were absent, but until the October Revolution, they had been members. They had been members of the same committees of those who were present. In a circumstance that gave us the right to equate those who were absent with those who were present, and their letters dealt with disagreements of Denikin on certain trivial questions, the peasant question. We were not told what these differences were, but they were evidently advising Denikin to give the land to the peasants. The Jewish question, they were evidently advising him not to return to the previous restrictions. The federated nationalities question, enough said, it's clear. The question of the structure of the government, democracy rather than dictatorship, and similar matters. And what conclusion did this evidence suggest? Very simple. It proved the fact of correspondence. And it also proved the agreement, the unanimity of those present with Denikin. Grr. But there were also direct accusations against those present that they had exchanged information with acquaintances who lived in outlying areas, Kiev, for example, which were not under the control of Soviet authorities. In other words, this used to be Russia, let's say, but then the interests of world revolution, we ceded this one piece to Germany, and people continued to exchange letters. How are you doing there, Ivan Ivanovich? Here's how things are going with us. And Kishkin, a member of the Central Committee of the Cadets, was so brazen as to justify himself right from the defendant's bench. Quote, a man doesn't want to be blind. He tries to find out everything he can about what's going on everywhere. Unquote. To find out everything about what's going on everywhere, he doesn't want to be blind. Well, all one can say is that the accuser correctly described their actions as treason to the Soviet power. But their most heinous acts were something else again. In the midst of the Civil War, they wrote books, composed memoranda, projects. Yes, as experts in constitutional law, financial science, economic relationships, the system of justice, the education, they wrote books. And one might easily guess their works had not been based on earlier works by Lenin, Trotsky, and Bukharin. Professor Kolyarevsky wrote on a federal structure of Russia. V.I. Stemkovsky on the agrarian question, no doubt without collectivization. V.S. Marlevich on education in the future Russia, and Vinogradsky on economics. And the great biologist N.K. Koltsov, who never received anything from the motherland except persecution and execution, allowed all those bourgeois big shots to get together in his institute for their discussions. N.D. Kondratyev was included here also. In 1931, he was condemned once and for all in connection with the TKP, the fictitious Working Peasants Party. Our accuser's heart jumps right out of our chest, outrunning the sentence. Well, what punishment was adequate for these assistants general? Just one, of course, to be shot. That was not merely what the accuser demanded. It was the sentence of the tribunal. Alas, it was later commuted to concentration camp until the end of the Civil War. And indeed, the defendants' guilt consisted in the fact that they hadn't sat in their own corners, sucking on their quarter-pound of bread, that they had, quote, talked things over and reached agreements as to what the state structure should be after the fall of the Soviet regime, unquote. In contemporary scientific language, this is known as the study of the alternative possibility. The voice of the accuser thundered, but we hear some kind of crack in it, as if his eyes were searching the rostrum, looking for another piece of paper. A quotation, perhaps? Give it to him, on tiptoe, quick, quick. Give him one at random, for some other trial. It's not important. Wasn't this the one? Nikolai Vasilyevich Krylenko. For the concept of torture inheres that the very fact of holding political prisoners in prison, unquote. So that's it. It is torture to keep political prisoners in prison. And the accuser said so. What a generous view. A new jurisprudence is arising. And further, quote, struggle against the Tsarist government was second nature to them, the politicals, and not to struggle against Tsarism was something of which they were incapable, unquote. What's that? They were incapable of not studying alternative possibilities? Perhaps thinking was first nature to the intellectual. Alas, through stupidity, they had shoved the wrong quotations at him. Now, wasn't that a mix-up for you? But Nikolai Vasilyevich was already off to the races. Quote, and even if the defendants here in Moscow did not lift a finger, and it looks very much as though that's the way it was, at such a movement, nevertheless, even a conversation over a teacup as to the kind of system that should replace the Soviet system, which is allegedly about to fall, is a counter-revolutionary act. During the Civil War, not only is any kind of action against Soviet power a crime, but the fact of inaction is also criminal, unquote. Well, now, everything is comprehensible. Everything is clear. They are being sentenced to death for inaction, for a cup of tea. Petrograd intellectuals, for example, decided that in the event of Yudinich's taking of the city, they would, first of all, concern themselves with convening a democratic municipal Duma, unquote. In other words, to safeguard the city against a possible dictatorship. Krylenko, I would like to shout at them, quote, it was your duty to think first of all how you might die in battle, so as not to allow Yudinich into the city, unquote. But they didn't die in battle, nor, in fact, did Nikolai Vasilyevich Krylenko. In addition, there were certain defendants who knew about all this talk and yet kept silent, did not write denunciations. In our contemporary lingo, he knew it, but he didn't tell. And here is another real example, not merely of inaction, but of actively criminal action through L.N. Khrushcheva, a member of the political Red Cross, and there she was, on the defendant's bench. Some of the other defendants had raised money to help the Turkey prisoners. One can just picture that food as capital pouring into prison commissary, and they had supplied various articles too. Yes, indeed, just look. Woolens too, perhaps. Woolens. There were no bounds to their evil doing, nor would there be, say, any limits to their proletarian punishment. As when a cinema projector starts slowing down, 28 pre-revolutionary male and female faces flicker past us in a film that's fuzzy and askew. We didn't notice their expressions. Were they frightened, contemptuous, proud? We don't have their answers. Their last words are missing. Because of technical considerations. But making up for this lack, the accuser croons to us, quote, "From beginning to end, it was self-flagellation and repentance for the mistakes they committed, the political instability and the interim nature of the intelligentsia." Yes, here comes another one, interim nature. Completely justified that Marxist evaluation of the intelligentsia made by the Bolsheviks, unquote. I don't know. Perhaps they did engage in self-flagellation. Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps the passion to save one's life at any cost had already come into being. Perhaps the old dignity of the intelligentsia had still been maintained. I don't know. Who was that young woman flashing past? That was Tolstoy's daughter, Aleksandra. Krylenko asked her, "What did you do during these conversations?" And she answered, "I attended to the samovar, 3 years of concentration camp." And who was that man over there? His face was familiar. It was Sava Morozov. But listen here, after all, gave the Bolsheviks all that money. And now he has handed a little to these people. 3 years in prison, but release him on probation. Let that be a lesson to him. And that's how the sun of our freedom rose. It was just such a well-nourished little imp that our Octoberist child, law, began to grow. Today we don't remember this at all. And that's how the sun of our freedom rose. It was as just such a well-nourished little imp that our Octoberist child, law, began to grow. Today we don't remember this at all. That is such a beautiful event.